What is it like to compose music for a machine to play? In this episode, we're looking at compositions on piano rolls written especially for the pianola.
You're listening to Finding Pieces, a podcast on pianos, people, and music.
Welcome to Finding Pieces. In this season, we're looking into the topic of piano rolls, and this episode, we're looking at compositions especially written on piano rolls for a kind of player piano, a pianola. Now, you might be thinking, player pianos are still pianos, so there really isn't much difference between pianola compositions and piano compositions, right? Not quite. The main difference is that instead of getting the pianist to play all the notes on the piano, on a pianola, the piano plays the notes, and you have an operator, a pianolist, who has real-time control of the artistic interpretation of dynamics and tempo through moving levers and pedals. So essentially, the player function, the machinery within a pianola, does most of the technical hard work. What I'm trying to find out in this episode are the composer's intention for composing on semi-automated instruments in the 1910s, 1920s. That is, music performed partly by machine and partly by human beings. And we can use this discussion as a springboard to think about music on machines, or music composed for machines, or even music written by AI. In this episode, we're going to look at pianola compositions from mainly three time frames. So the early experiments before World War I, the harvest season between 1917 and 1921, and post-1930s. I'll be referring to works by various composers including Busoni, Arnold Bax, Percy Grainger, and Conlon Nancarrow. And I want to use their work to point to the different attitudes on composing for this new instrument/machine. And these attitudes reflect the thoughts of an individual as well as thoughts of a collective group at a certain time. The key question we're asking is, what opportunities do pianolas and piano rolls offer in the way that music is being made and performed on the piano? Before we start exploring the compositions written especially for the pianola, I like to propose that there is actually a much larger pool of compositions for the player piano on piano rolls which we don't really consider and which we have taken for granted. As I have hinted in other episodes, pianists do record arrangement of pieces for opera, orchestral, arias and waltzes on piano rolls, and some of these arrangements are not found in any score-notated forms. In fact, there are plenty of pianola-only compositions that are in the jazz and popular genre on piano rolls, where the composers are often uncredited for their creativity. So really, there was plenty more of these pianists and composers in the 1920s and 30s who embraced this newfound technology to create interesting possibilities. The actual pool of credited pianola compositions, as in those which explicitly say for the pianola, is fairly small. As far as we can trace, the first of these compositions appeared in the 1905 Aeolian catalogue. The introduction and Andante Grazioso by Homer Newton Bartlett, which said it was written expressively for the pianola. Another piece on the list, the improvisation in C-sharp minor, was also a new pianola composition, being improvised especially for the Aeolian company. During this time, the main purpose of a pianola is so that pieces can be played on the pianos in homes by people who might not necessarily be great pianists, but have competent musical abilities to make music sound good. Thus, for the consumers of this time, a good pianola composition is one which allows the practicing of these skills. It was not about drawing too much attention to the intricacies of music innovation as such. There were composers who considered about breakthroughs for pianola compositions before the First World War. One frequently quoted example is Ferruccio Busoni. In around 1907 to 1908, Busoni started composing this piece called Further Pianola, but he only left fragments of this piece behind. Busoni never finished the composition, and we don't know the reason why, but we do know that during this time, he was very much thinking about the philosophies and aesthetics of music. So in 1907, he published this book called Sketch of a New Aesthetic of Music, and in it he writes, "Notation, the writing of compositions, is primarily an ingenious expedient for catching an inspiration, with the purpose of exploiting it later. But notation is to improvisation as the portrait to the living model. It is for the interpreter to resolve the rigidity of the signs into primitive emotion." Having read this, I thought that maybe for Busoni, one of the reasons why he hadn't finished the pianola composition was that he was using these as a means to explore breaking grounds for piano compositions, the piano which remained his principal instrument and the interpreter is the pianist himself within. If we look at his transcriptions and adaptations from other genres for the piano, we see that Busoni has produced a bulk of them before 1900s, and then there was this period of rest where there were very few products between 1901 and 1910, and then after 1910s his creativity started to kick off again. So for Busoni, I believe that his philosophy was to use the pianola as a means to challenge what is humanistically possible, so for himself as the pianist to achieve the pinnacle of pianism. This philosophy of contemplating on what was humanly impossible in regards to musicking was shared and advocated, particularly in England after the First World War. In the Musical Times in 1917, the British music critic Edwin Evans proposed that self-playing instruments would liberate composers from the limitation of physical technique, to free themselves from all the mechanical restrictions appertaining to the use of 10 fingers, which at present limit the number, rapidity, and distance of the notes used. In other words, how fast can notes on a piano really be played? How long can notes be held on? And what happens when we play more than 10 notes at the same time? Later that year, Evans sent out requests on behalf of the Aeolian Company for original compositions for the pianola to composers in Britain as well as composers in Europe. Igor Stravinsky was the first to come back to his request and submitted his Etude pour pianola, a piece which he had already written a couple of years back. But the Aeolian Company waited until more composers got back to them, and it was not until 1921 that these works were premiered at the Aeolian Hall in London on October the 13th, 1921. And these works, a series of 15 special pianola rolls, were issued out in that autumn. These compositions are a display of absolute artistic novelty, but they were commercially unpopular. So we find very few mentions of these works being performed after their premiere, and even now we hear very little mentioning of their performance. I want to spend a couple of minutes looking at one of these compositions, Arnold Bax's Scherzo for the pianola. The history of this piece is quite interesting. Arnold Bax originally intended this piece to be the second movement of a piano sonata, which now is nowhere to be found. The piece was apparently orchestrated in 1917 as Scherzo Sinfonico, but this version is also nowhere to be found. The pianola version was released in piano roll format in 1921, before its final reorchestrated version in 1933, known to us as the Symphonic Scherzo. Music critics have listened to the orchestral version and have criticized the harmony and even the orchestration being rather basic and unadventurous compared to Arnold Bax's other compositions. But if one hears the music being played through a pianola and sees the graphic visualization of this on the roll, I would think that they would say otherwise, and it really shows that this piece is first and foremost intended for the piano. Visual breakthroughs in terms of score notation, as well as new textural sounds from the piano, was also very much evident in many of these Aeolian commissioned pianola rolls. In addition, these pieces being interpreted by pianolas offered something different, which is to what a pianist can give on a piano. A few more pianola compositions arise after 1921, in both score-notated formats and some of them being only on the piano rolls. For example, Philip Christian Danton has in his portfolio collection 3 compositions for the pianola, one written in 1929 and one in 1930, which to my knowledge has not been punched out on a piano roll. When you just look at the score notations, you don't get that exact same visual impact as that if you were looking from a piano roll. But the challenge of attesting human performance limitation in terms of technique, emotion, and sound was still there. I also tried playing another pianola composition, this time Harry Jo's Caprice, which exists on a piano roll, but it does not come in score-notated format. When I was doing this, I soon realized that it wasn't about trying to achieve on the piano the exactness of what can be done on the pianola, but learning what the essence of the music is as written for the pianola. The way that the machinery and the instruments move, and the way that a pianolist would conduct a musical line. In this way, my interpretation of the music would be different to how a pianolist would interpret the pianola composition. There is a limit to how much a pianist can do with pianola-dedicated compositions, and I think it is even more difficult when a piece of music is arranged for the pianola. One composer that I am thinking of, and which did not appear in Aeolian's 1921 list, is Percy Grainger. Grainger was one of those composers that did a lot of strange and interesting things with composing music on piano rolls. And he was also a composer who was fascinated with using audio technology as well as experimentations in electronic sounds. I mean, he used a phonograph to collect native folk singing in England in the early 1900s, and also made use of theremin to espouse his idea on free music in the 1930s-40s. Anyway, back to piano rolls. Grainger made 2 arrangements for the pianola in 1914 of Molly on the Shore and Shepherd's Hay. He continued his fascinations with Aeolian's DuoArt pianola, where he could record on the rolls, possibly more than once to superimpose the recordings, and then also added extra perforations by hand. If you listen to Grainger's arrangement of the Grieg Piano Concerto for 1 piano on the DuoArt roll, what you hear is not a pianist playing a concerto, but an orchestra being played through a piano. It's quite surreal. Lastly, there is one more composer I wish to draw on, and that is Conlon Nancarrow. Conlon Nancarrow said that in the 1940s no one would play his instrumental works, so he had to look for other means of playing his own music. And he confided these in player pianos. In fact, 2 Ampico player pianos, which he started with. On piano rolls, he would temper it with complex schemes of tempo and rhythm, and apparently all his music composing was planned on blank piano roll and then punched out, and after that, finally written down in conventional musical notation. When I interviewed Rex Lawson for an episode a few weeks back, we actually talked about Nancarrow, and Rex's thoughts are that pianists too often consider Nancarrow's music as a means of technical transcendence, yet there was no mountain to climb, and that Nancarrow's music is supposed to have this pacified humour.
Conlon's music, dynamics were not his, or the subtlety of dynamics was not the point with his music. He made his music to be contrapuntal, and you had different levels, and it isn't written for the piano.
No, it's not very pianistic.
No, and pianists never play as well as a player piano when they're playing Conlon's music. They don't get the rhythms accurate enough because they're too much messing around with trying to play the right notes and so on. And the reason they do it is to prove that they can do it. which means they're building a mountain when there isn't one. There was no mountain. His music was meant to be very simple to play. And if you start imposing this heroism in it, supposed heroism, you're getting in the way of the music. You're turning it into your own showcase, and it isn't that.
So there we have it, a few selections of pianola compositions. To end, let us hear the emulation of Arnold Bax's Scherzo in its entirety. The music we're about to hear is far from perfect because it lacks a performer's input of interpretation. And likewise, compositions, whether written for an instrument or machine, remains incomplete if left unperformed. Enjoy and see you in the next episode.